answer those questions. Also, just to note that we are going to be recording this training, and it'll be on the website, on the PIMS website in the next week or so for any colleagues that weren't able to be on the live webinar today. And also you'll see in the chat box we have a link if you need the closed captions to just click on that link and it'll open another box where you can access and be able to view the closed captioning alongside the webinar. Okay, so that kind of covers it for any housekeeping items. So our agenda today is we're going to present an overview of the Payback Information Management System, or PIMS, this new system that we are very excited will be launching on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, letting all of you grantees that are on the call will be able to start going in next week and entering data and seeing what we've been talking about now for quite a while with all of you. You can get in and start doing it. Then we're going to talk in some detail about the different components of the system, looking at what you as a grantee will be responsible for, also for your scholars, what they're going to need to do in the system, and employers. We'll do a live demonstration of the system so you can see what the system looks like, how you're going to log in, how you will, if you want to add a secondary user or a person that works at the university with you that you may want coming in to help kind of do some of the data entry work, and then how you'll fill out and submit the scholar records, or all that information that you're providing about each of your scholars. Then at the end, we'll talk about some of the resources that we have available for you, as well as scholars and employers, and then we'll have time for some question and answer. So PIMS is an online data collection system, and it's available year-round. So at any time during the year, you're able to go in and update your scholars' data. Its purpose is to collect and analyze data on scholars who are funded by RLTT grants, and also to track the service obligation of scholars who are funded. And it's replacing the RSA Management Information System, which had been doing those same functions. That system is going away, and now instead of going every year into the MIS, you'll be able to go into PIMS, but again, it'll be accessible all year round at any time. So some of the benefits of PIMS are that now scholars are going to be able to get into this system, and they'll be able to take a look at the information that you're putting in about them just to verify that that information is accurate. Also in PIMS, scholars will be able to electronically submit their employment data. And in PIMS, grantees will be able to electronically review the employment information scholars enter, and then employers will be able to also view that employment information and verify that it's accurate and the scholar is indeed, working in that position. So in terms of accessing PIMS, again, it's available year-round, online access. It's a web-based system. Starting on Tuesday is when you all as grantees will be able to get into the system. We are rolling out the launch of it to grantees in groups. So you all are kind of our first group of project directors that we're letting in. And then in September, we'll be letting in the rest of the project directors who have grants that we need to get updated in the system. Also, in terms of access to scholars, we will be letting them in the system starting around November. So we wanted to give all of you grantees a chance, a couple months to go in there and put all of the data and information in about your scholars, and then start letting the scholars in around November. And once the scholars can get in, that's also when the employers will be able to get in once the scholars start entering and submitting their employment information. specifically in terms of access, you're going to be logging in using your email and then a password that you'll create. Also, because we are collecting personally identifiable information in this system, we require multi-factor authentication as an additional protection of that highly sensitive data. And we will talk a little bit more about the multi-factor authentication. We do have a number of extensive resources on the website that really walk you through step-by-step how to install the app that you will need on your phone to use the multi-factor authentication and all of those steps. So we're not going to actually go, step-by-step today on setting that up, but I will show you when we do the demo what it looks like when you're logging in and using the multi-factor authentication. If you ever have trouble accessing the system or any other questions at all related to the system, we have a help desk that's available at rltthelpdesk@ed.gov, and our phone number is 1-800-832-8142. We mentioned that numerous times throughout this presentation, the help desk information, and it's also on the website, so you'll see it often. And we are going to be available 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday through Friday. So the multi-factor authentication, hopefully most of you are familiar with it or are already using it for other reasons. I believe, like to access G5, you are already using a multi-factor authentication process, but it's really a dual authentication whereby you are accessing the system multiple ways to make sure that it's really you that's going into the system and not somebody else trying to log in as you. So you'll log in using your email and password that only you should know that you set up, that password. And then the second factor is on your phone, you'll be installing an app that will then be just generating random codes, and you'll be entering that code into the system every time you log in as well. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, what that looks like. But there are a lot more resources on the website to really explain in detail how it is you go about setting that up initially. Again, I mentioned we are collecting personally identifiable information, so we have a number of protections in place for that, including the multi-factor authentication. Just to name a few other things, all of the Social Security numbers that are stored in the database are encrypted. We track all of the system activity in the data in the system too, so we have a log that shows anytime somebody logs in, anytime a user gets deleted or data are changed, that we look at to track and just make sure that nothing strange or unusual seems to be happening. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron, and he's going to talk about the data collection components.
All right, thank you, Amy. And the way that PIMS is set up is somewhat similar to MIS. Obviously, it follows the same program regulations and requirements. However, the roles and the information that are uploaded within PIMS are certainly different from previous data submissions that you've done under the MIS, so we want to review that for you all. So the data collection process is likely very familiar to you all, where the scholar and you as the university will complete the payback agreement. In PIMS, you will, as a university, enter the scholar data as well as the agreement into the PIMS system. After the scholar completes the program or exits without completion, excuse me, sorry. When the scholar exits the program and you will create and complete an exit certification that again will be uploaded to PIMS, and either the scholar will immediately begin fulfilling their service obligation or enter into their grace period. Scholars who enter into immediately begin fulfilling their service obligation will then submit employment into the PIMS system, and we'll talk about that in a moment, what that looks like and means. After they submit that information into the PIMS system, you as the project director and the grantee will determine whether that employment is eligible, and then that will then be sent, if you agree, that the employer will then have an opportunity to verify that the employment submitted by the scholar is in fact valid. And if so, and they also approve, then the scholar will receive credit towards their service obligation. Again, we'll talk in a little more detail about that entire process in a few moments. If after exiting, the scholar enters into their grace period and is not in compliance with the repayment status or exits early without completing 1 year, they will enter a repayment status or be processed for a deferral or waiver or exception. And again, we'll go through how each of these scenarios play out within the PIMS system in a few moments. Some of the things that are key components to remember that the different roles that will take place within the system. I know with MIS, it was just you, the grantee, that was responsible primarily. But within PIMS, there are definitive roles and responsibilities for each, the grantee, scholar, and employer. So you as grantees are certainly responsible for completing, in conjunction with the scholar, the payback agreements and exit certifications and uploading them into the system, entering and continuing to update scholar information regarding within the scholar record. So that's contact information, demographic information, information about their training and funding. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you'll continue to determine if a scholar's employment is eligible through the PIMS system itself. Scholars will have a responsibility to review and confirm that the scholar record, that their scholar record is in fact correct, including their contact and other information related to demographics and training. They will also be responsible for uploading and entering in their employment information and ensuring that any questions that you or the employer may have regarding what they submit related to employment information is addressed, as well as ensuring that their employers do in fact verify their scholar information or their employment information. And then finally, if they do require a deferral or waiver, they will process and submit information and documentation related to both deferrals or waivers through the PIMS system itself. And then finally, the third role being employers. They, again, as we mentioned, will have a responsibility and role within the system to actually review and verify scholars' employment information after you, the grantee, have in fact confirmed that it is eligible employment. So in terms of immediate activities that are important to note and immediate dates, for you grantees, we are asking that you try to log into the PIMS system and begin reviewing scholar records and in processing, updating their information within the system. Certainly logging in by August 30th to ensure that you have adequate access to the system. If you need to add secondary users to help you begin to develop and populate some of the scholar records within the system, we are asking that you do so by August 30th. Then by October 31st, we're requiring grantees to complete and submit a scholar record for all scholars who have not yet completed his or her payback obligation. And we'll get into, there certainly is information that we have pulled in from the MIS for those that for those scholars that you have previously entered information into the MIS for, but also creating new scholar records in PIMS for scholars who have just recently enrolled in your program that were not in the MIS. So in terms of the requirements or actions that you would need to take to update and submit the scholar record for each scholar who has not yet completed, either the program and their service or their payback obligation. The two major activities are to upload completed agreements that are applicable to the scholars, so payback agreements, and if they have exited the program, to ensure that they have a completed exit certification included, as well as, I mentioned earlier, entering in scholar contact information, demographic information, and training information as part of their scholar record. And again, this includes not only scholars who were previously within the MIS system, but also those that have enrolled since the MIS system itself. So as I mentioned earlier, we have migrated the data from the MIS system to PIMS. So there will be certainly information within each scholar record that you simply will need to review and confirm its accuracy. And in addition, scholars who have either fulfilled their obligation, already have an approved waiver, or have been referred for payment, you do not have to worry about updating their scholar record and ensuring and processing that during this initial phase. So that is not something that you as grantees need to worry about. It is simply those that have not yet completed their payback obligation within the system. Ongoing activities that you as grantees will be responsible for, as I mentioned earlier, a primary activity that you'll be responsible for will be within PIMS, reviewing and determining if their employment is eligible. The scholar, which we'll talk in a moment how they will submit employment, but after they submit employment to you as a grantee, you'll have the ability to go in, review the uploaded documentation, and determine whether it is in fact eligible. Doing so will trigger an email to the scholar to let them know of your decision. And if your decision is that it is not eligible, it'll provide them with the opportunity to go back into the employment record, either address concerns that you may have within the system, or certainly trigger a notification to connect with you for any discussion that you may need about your employment. If they're about their employment. If they do confirm, if you do approve their employment, it will trigger an email be sent to the listed employer by the scholar, which will provide the employer the opportunity to review the employment submitted and approve it for verification as well. Additional ongoing activities that are that you as grantees will be responsible for will be once a year for scholar records to review and update them as long as they are still continuing to receive funding. And then certainly add additional scholars that enroll in your programs and create these scholar records for them. Things that you will not need to do within PIMS will be to update scholar records for scholars after they graduate or exit the program. And other than continuing to review employment that is submitted, you will not need to worry about updating the actual scholar records themselves, and that won't be a responsibility of yours moving forward. The only exception to this would be if a scholar requires an exception or waiver due to either them becoming severely ill or if they are deceased, we will try to coordinate and work with you as the grantee to help prepare the necessary documentation to do so, so we will need your assistance during that scenario. But otherwise, once they graduate or exit the program, you will not need to update their scholar record. So a review of the current timeline and activities you'll be responsible for. So again, logging into the system by August 30th, and then before October 31st, completing and submitting all of the scholar records for scholars who have not yet completed their payback obligation. And again, that will include uploading the payback agreements and exit certifications, as well as updating their actual scholar record, including demographic training and employment, demographic training and contact information. In addition, by October 31st, adding any additional scholars who are newly enrolled and creating the scholar record and uploading the relevant scholar agreements as well. Between October 31st and whenever your scholar graduates or exits the program, we ask that you update scholar records anytime there is a change to their status within 30 days, as well as scholars who enroll in the program within 30 days. We ask that you upload and enter in the new scholar into the system and create a new scholar record. Once the scholar has exited, and until they've completed their payback agreement or payback obligation, the only requirements of you will be to continue to review and determine if their submitted employment is in fact eligible for payback. As part of the system and our staff, we will certainly monitor and follow up with you as grantees to ensure that you're meeting those deadlines and timelines. In particular, if you have not submitted or updated scholar information, we will work with you to ensure that it's updated in a timely manner. And certainly, we work very closely with RSA to help ensure that the data reported into the PIMS system is accurate and submitted on time and complete. You know this certainly with the terms of your grant themselves, but you know, the regulations of the RLTT program require for you to submit timely and complete data as one of the conditions of your grant, and so it is RSA takes that very seriously and relies on us certainly to help facilitate the submission of on-time data as much as possible with grantees. If you're not submitting your data in a timely and complete manner, it certainly can jeopardize current or future funding for your grant and university. So we strongly encourage you to plan accordingly and submit your data on time. We will go through resources and staff available to be able to help you submit your data in a timely manner later on in the session. And we are more than happy to work with you if you are struggling to submit your data on time or in a complete manner, and if you have questions to do so. There are numerous resources available to help you. So shifting from your responsibilities as grantees to your scholars themselves, we've mentioned a bunch of this previously, but scholars will receive an email to access the PIMS system in November for those that are already within the system that you have submitted by October 31st. Those that are added after November will be notified once you submit the scholar record into the system. So starting in November, your current scholars will receive access to PIMS. They'll receive a welcome email from our system. And the activities that they'll need to do within the system initially will be to review their scholar record, including contact information, training information, service obligation information as well. Once they have exited the program, and they have obtained employment, they will be responsible for submitting employment into the system for you and their employer's review. And the information that they'll be required to submit through the system will be the name and contact information of the employer, the dates in which they have started, and if they are no longer employed there, the end dates, a description of whether the position is full-time or part-time, their title, as well as a full description of their job duties themselves. And again, once they submit that that employment for eligibility review, it will go to you as the grantee to determine whether it is in fact eligible. When they submit, as I just mentioned, into PIMS, when they submit their information, they will only receive credit for their submitted employment until after you and the employer have in fact verified that it is in fact eligible to pay down their payback obligation. That's an important item to note for two reasons. One, we certainly know that when scholars submit employment information, they then will invariably look at how much time they have remaining on their obligation, and they will not see that credit be applied to their obligation until it is in fact approved by you and their employer. And so that's an important note to remind your scholars that it will take a little time for it to be applied, but presuming it is eligible employment, it certainly will be applied to their obligation. It is also an important note for them to consider because the scholars themselves are responsible for ensuring that their employers do respond to the requests for employment verification. We are certainly here to help you and your scholars to work with their employers to verify their information. We are more than happy to resend notifications or things of that sort through the system, but ultimately your scholars need to ensure that their employers receive those system-generated emails and provide a response as to whether that employment is eligible or not. And they will certainly know that that has occurred based on whether the credit has been applied to their obligation. So, and then in the scenario that they do not secure qualifying employment, they will be it will be effective that their obligation will be referred for repayment. So it's extremely important for them to be vigilant in following up with their employers when they submit employment in the system. As we mentioned previously, scholars will be able to submit waiver requests if they're unable to obtain employment, either due to a disability or some sort of functional limitation. To request a waiver within the system, they would submit documentation into PIMS, one being a letter on letterhead from their physician, if it's a medical or waiver or disability waiver. So they would submit a letter with a description of the disability or functional limitation preventing them from eligible employment, as well as medical records that may support their current functional limitations and disabilities. Similarly, for deferral requests, they will submit that through PIMS as well, and that would apply to a medical deferment, educational deferment, if they are enrolled in a vocational rehab program, as well, they can receive a deferment for that, as well as other scenarios that may come up with that come through with prior approval from RSA. So again, to submit and to request rather a deferral within the system, scholars will be asked to provide a letter or transcript showing that they are in fact fully enrolled in a vocational rehab program with their estimated graduation date. If they're requesting educational deferral, for a medical deferral, they'll be asked for their medical records and letter from the treating physician that within the last 3 months to ensure it is up to date. And then certainly if there is another reason that you're requesting a deferral, we ask that that scholars contact the PIMS help desk staff directly, and we will process that deferral in coordination with that scholar. And one helpful note for scholars that are requesting deferments, educational deferments, if it is a multi-year deferment, they'll be asked to submit documentation on an annual basis to reestablish that they are still currently enrolled in that full-time program. Okay. And then the third major user group, the employers, as we said previously, their responsibility within the system will be to verify employment. So once the scholar submits their employment, you determine that it is in fact eligible, they will receive an email, automated email from our system to review the data entered in by the scholar to confirm that it is in fact accurate, and they will be given the opportunity either to approve it and then the credit will be applied to the scholar's obligation, or if they disagree, they'll be given the opportunity to provide justification as to why, and then the scholar will be notified and asked to either clarify or resubmit their employment based on the described disagreement from the employer. So to review a few of the major differences between the previous system PIMS and, the previous system, the MIS and PIMS, for you as grantees, we know this was available just to you and only really for a few months of the year. PIMS is available 24/7, full year, all year round, and not only available to you, but also the scholars and employers. So this is important, an important note for you to continue to maintain and update the scholar records within your system. If a scholar changes their status or you enroll a new scholar, as we said previously, you'll be required to update or enter their scholar record within 30 days rather than during a single portion of the year. So that's an extremely important note for you as grantees. And then certainly some of the differences that we described over the last few minutes where you as employers were the primary responsible entity for entering in their employment information into the system, whereas scholars now have that responsibility within PIMS. For waivers and deferrals, as we said, that was previously on the grantee to collect and submit that information to RSA. Now that responsibility will be in the hands of the scholar. And then finally, for repayment referrals, grantees used to be responsible for submitting scholars for repayment during the data reporting period. Now PIMS regularly generates a report to identify the scholars that should be entered into a repayment status, and then we coordinate with RSA to review and determine which scholars in fact should be referred for repayment. For that, I'll turn it over to Amy to provide a demonstration of the system.
Okay, so I'm just going to check and see if we have any questions that have come in the chat box. Everyone is still muted just to help with the sound quality, but please, at any time, if you do have questions, pop them in the chat box and we can take them along the way. Messing up with our mouse. Okay. So now I'm going to share my screen and hop over to our website. If you were able to attend the NCRE conference this past spring, you've already kind of gotten a glimpse at our website. We did a bit of a demonstration there, and now all of you will get to look at it and start using it, hopefully, very soon. This that you're seeing right here is not the actual live website. This is a test site that we use for development and testing purposes. So this pdpdemo.westdet.com URL you're seeing is not the actual website. You'll get the URL in the notification you get next week for the actual website. But I'll start out just by kind of briefly showing you on this left-hand side, under where it says Home. Can you help me again? I don't understand. Sorry, any major issues with our mouse. You'll see there's a list of pages that are publicly accessible to anybody. You don't have to have a login to get to any of these pages. A few of the really critical ones that I wanted to point out are the Training and Resources page. This one has links on it to a number of resources and webinars and all of those things that we've developed. Sorry, I'm having issues majorly, so I might switch to a different, let me switch to a different. Okay, make it easier. Okay, so on this page, we have it sort of divided up by user type. We have scholars and resources for them, as well as grantees. We have a number of those multi-factor authentication resources, and we have some for employers too. This page, we really hope you'll take the time to visit frequently and look at all these materials and also point your scholars to this page, as well as this page that has several sets of frequently asked questions on it. We have a set of regulatory frequently asked questions, and these mostly come from your payback manual that the program has been using, having to do with things like repayments and deferrals and waivers and eligible employment and the regulatory types of questions that come up. And then we also have a set of PIMS, frequently asked questions. Those are more, how do I do certain things in the system? How do I access the system? How do I add a secondary user? How do I, when you're a scholar, how do I submit employment? So those types of questions. So if you do have any questions having to do with the system or the regulatory questions, please take a look at the frequently asked questions first to see if your question is answered there, and then obviously, reach out to us at the help desk. You'll see on the left-hand side we have a page that says Contact Help Desk. Also, we always have up on this page the phone number, address, fax number, email of how to get in touch with the help desk. We do also, from here, have a link to the regulations that you can kind of easily get to then if needed, and just a few other pages that are accessible to anybody. So to log in, you'll see up in this right-hand corner up here, it says Secure Login. So you'll click on that, and next week, when you get the email from RLTT Help Desk at ed.gov, it's going to explain that what you'll need to do this very first time is click on where it says Forgot Password, and you'll enter in the email address. It's the email that we have for you, that we've been using to email you all along. So that's the email that you'll use, and then you'll just click on Reset Password, and then you will get an email that looks like this, with a link and an encrypted key, and you will just need to copy the key, go to the link. You'll enter that key in, and then you'll set up your password. There are rather strict requirements for the length of the password and what needs to be required, so you'll type in your password. If it doesn't meet the requirements, you'll get a message and you'll have to try something else. Once you've entered in and put in your acceptable password, you'll get directed right back to this login page where you will enter in your email and the password that you just created. So I'm going to log in as a made-up test grantee. And here you'll see, I guess, the message about onto your phone, open up your app, and then just type in the code. Oops, just changed on me. And then hit validate. And it might take a couple seconds to open up your page. When you the very first time you log in, you're going to see a message here with information with our rules of behavior and also a Privacy Act notice. So you would click, I agree to the terms. And then this is what the page looks like as soon as you log in. At the top, this grant profile summary just lists all of the grants that you have. So you'll see all of your grants at one time. You don't have to log in separately for each grant that you are the project director for. It'll list your grants, it lists who is the project director, that should be you. And then if you have a secondary user, which is a person you want to let have access to the system, someone with the university who works on the grants, if you want help with data entry, that person would be listed here, and then just the start and end dates of the grants. In the grant personnel section, we have it'll list you as the department super user, who's the project director under this RSA PIMS role column, and then any secondary users you've added for any of your grants will also be listed here. You can edit at any time. If you want to change the email address that we have in the system for you, you can do that here. If you want to change your phone number, all of that information you can edit yourself. Also, you can add or change who you have in the system as the secondary user. So to add a new secondary user, there's a couple ways. One is you click on this Add Personnel link, and you would just enter their first name, last name, and email are the required fields. Those are the ones that have the red asterisk that you need in order to save that new personnel you added. And then once you've added them, you go back up to the grant profile summary, and you would select the grant that you want to add them to for a secondary user. And then where it says select the secondary user for this grant, their name will be listed in the drop-down, and you would pick who you want to assign as the secondary user, and then you would click on Edit Grants, and then they would then appear listed as a secondary user for the grant that you just added them to. So now we see Molly Richards is now the secondary user for both of the grants. Scrolling down, you will see the information about each of your grants, kind of at a high level, the aggregated counts for several statuses that we track in the system. The first one is the record entry status. So you'll see for this grant, this Test B090012 grant, we have the grant number up here. The record entry status shows us how many scholar records there are in the system for this grant. So this is, you know, the way it'll look when you log in next week. Let's say you had 10 scholars in the MIS for this grant, so you'll see that there's 10 scholar records now in PIMS. Of those, 5 of the records are submitted and 5 are pending. You'll see when we look at the scholar record, you have the option to save a record for later. If you haven't completed the full record, maybe you go through it and realize you don't have all the information that you need about the scholar, so you need to save it for later, so it's in a pending status. And then the scholar records that are submitted are the ones that you actually have completed fully and click submit and are done, at least have the most updated data for that point in time. As Erin mentioned before, for scholars who have already fulfilled their payback in the MIS, so scholars who have obligations, fulfill their obligation, whether monetarily or through service, scholars who are in a repayment status, and scholars who have waivers. All of those scholars are going to show up as submitted records in PIMS from the MIS, because those records are done and closed for your purposes, for the scholar record. There's nothing else you need to do on the scholar record for those scholars. So you'll see for this grant, there's 5 of those scholars, and then the 5 that are pending, those are the records that, you know, we've started for you already in PIMS. We have, the data that was in the MIS already moved over for those records, but they're in a pending status because you need to go in and complete those records and then submit them. So moving over to the program completion status, that just gives you counts of how many scholars are currently enrolled in the program, how many have graduated, how many have exited without graduating. And those counts only include the submitted scholar records because the pending are still, not totally finalized yet. So that's why there's 5 with a program completion status. And similarly for the service obligation status, only scholars that are submitted records have that status. So for this grant, you'll see the 5 are because there's 3 that have fulfilled their obligation, 1 has a waiver, and 1 is in repayment. So those we know are done, and there's nothing further you need to do with those. And then lastly on this page, at the bottom, you'll see the project director certification, and that's where you will check and basically say that I have completed my reports, I've submitted all of the data, it's all up to date, and then you would click Save, and that just kind of indicates that, your data are done and ready at that point. Okay, so now I am going to show you the View All Scholar Records page, and this page is a list of all of the scholar records that are in the system for your grant, and this is also how you'll access each of their individual records when you need to go back in and either view them or make any updates. So when you are going in, starting next week, the first thing you'll do is come in here and just kind of take a look and see, are all of my scholars listed here? That should be. We did our very best to make sure all of the data got migrated over from the MIS, but you still may see perhaps a duplicate record. Maybe you'll see, Jane Kennedy, and then you'll see J. Kennedy listed also. And that was really just a function of the data. Maybe at some point in time in the MIS, the grantee might have changed their name or something like that, and we tried to clean up most of that, but there still could be some of it in there. If you see that, or if you look through your list and you say, oh, this scholar really, I don't know who that scholar is, they weren't funded under our grant, please contact us at the help desk, and we can remove scholar records that don't belong there, that are duplicate, and we can get that taken care of. So just please, look through the list and make sure that the list is accurate. Now, you'll see also on here, it just lists kind of in columns the date the record was first created, the date that it was updated, so we kind of know when was the last time, the grantee went in and made any updates to it. We have the record entry status, so that's just either whether the record's submitted or pending. Then for the scholars who are submitted, it shows their program completion status. So this first one, Frank Farley, is a submitted record, he graduated, and then it shows their service obligation status. This one has a waiver. It shows how many months of service obligation the scholar has fulfilled, how many months of service obligation the scholar has remaining to fulfill, also the date that the scholar must fulfill their service obligation by, and the total amount of funding. So just kind of, you're able to see like in one big table, all of your scholars and some important pieces of information. This employment column I'll come back to in a little bit, but that's how you're going to be looking at scholars' employment information to determine if it's eligible for payback. All of the submitted scholar records that are in there when you first go into the system are going to be read-only. You're not going to be able to make any changes because, again, these are the records that the scholars are done fulfilling their payback, and there is nothing further that needs to be done. If you do happen to notice a mistake that you want corrected for any of these, please contact the help desk, and we can take care of that for you. So now I'm just going to go into one of the pending scholar records, and we're going to walk through the record so you'll see exactly what data you're going to be entering about each of your scholars and also what information we have that we've moved over from the MIS. One thing to remember are these, it might be a little hard to see here, but there's red asterisks next to the required fields. So if there's a red asterisk, that's required for you to submit the record. Everything else, it's good if you have it to enter it in, but it's not required. So if you don't have the scholar's middle name or their maiden name, that's okay. You don't necessarily need to go back and get that at this point. It's not required. So in Section A is the identifying information, and we do have the scholar's names as you would enter them in the MIS. They'll appear here. That might mean in some cases, maybe in the MIS, it ended up being, you know, last name, first name. So you'll need to just correct the name so that it appears in the right fields. You'll put in their Social Security number and also their email. In Section B, you'll enter their address, city, state, zip code, and phone number. You can enter information in about a secondary address if there is one for the scholar that you have. Section C is alternate contact information. Again, this is only if the scholar is willing to provide it and you have it, but contact information for a person that knows the scholar, friend, or family member that if, you know, years down the road we're trying to get a hold of the scholar and we can't, then this person might be able to help us. Section D is where you'll be uploading the completed and signed payback agreement. So it looks like I already put one in for this one, but the way you'll do that is you click on Upload File, and then you'll click on Browse. You'll get a pop-up message that's just telling you to please remember to redact the Social Security numbers from the payback agreements, because you're already entering the Social Security number directly in the system, and just to minimize the amount of PII, we are asking that you redact it from the payback agreement. So then you would browse on your computer to the location of where you have that saved. I'm not on my computer, so I don't know that I'm going to be able to find a document here that I can show you with. But you would find the document that you want to upload. Then you would enter in the date that the payback agreement was signed. That's important when it comes to scholars who exit the program without completing it and don't complete one academic year, because if they signed their payback agreement after the regulations came into effect in September 2016, they wouldn't be eligible to fulfill their obligations through service. They would have to be referred for repayment, so we need to know when they signed that payback agreement, whether it was before or after the September 2016 regulations. And you can, since grantees are having scholars complete and sign payback agreements annually, we'll be able to upload, you know, each payback agreement and include the date that that it was signed. Section E is scholar demographic information, the scholar's gender, race, ethnicity, whether or not the scholar has a disability, the scholar's age. Those items are not required, so if you don't have them, you don't have to include it. Item 5 is whether or not the scholar received funding under a different RLTT grant, and if they did, you would include the grant number. The next few items have to do with indicating if the scholar is a U.S. citizen, national, or permanent resident. Also, item 8, you'll say whether or not the scholar has the capacity to complete the course of study. Item 9, whether or not the scholar expressed an interest in vocational rehabilitation in the field of study. Item 10, whether or not the scholar is capable of being employed once they complete the program. And then items 11 and 12 are some other upload fields. For 11, you'll upload the completed certification of eligibility for federal assistance in certain programs form. If you need the form, you can click here and you can access the blank form if you need to get to it. And then also following that, in item 11, you'll upload proof of U.S. citizenship or legal permanent resident status. Now, for both of these, because we understand a lot of you, the grants, you know, are older grants, scholars left the program many years ago. If you do not have either the certification of eligibility or proof of citizenship, you have the option to then check these boxes saying that you acknowledge that I don't have this available to upload, and that will suffice. we start seeing more of that data that came over from the MIS. It's the current training information, so the date the scholar enrolled in the program would come from the MIS, the date the scholar began receiving funding, also from the MIS, if it was there, the degree that the scholar was in training to receive, item 3. Item 4, also from the MIS, would be whether or not the scholar was a full-time or part-time student for each year that they were enrolled in the program. Item 5 is the total amount of funding the scholar received. All of these items obviously you can edit and change if they're not correct or need to be updated. So if this funding amount is what was in the MIS, but they've received more funding since then, please obviously update that. For the funding, for item 5, you also can upload financial documentation. We ask that it's not required, but we ask that you do that if you can, just so that there is kind of that evidence and proof to stand behind the funding amount that's entered in. Item 6 is whether or not the scholar was employed in a qualified position in the field of vocational rehabilitation for each year they were enrolled in the program. Then getting into section G has to do with the scholar's status. For number 1, you will check if the scholar is enrolled in the program and currently receiving funding, whether they are enrolled but are no longer receiving funding. Once they've exited, you'll change, they'll be listed here as enrolled for a number of years, and then you'll go in when they exit and change the response to that they've graduated, and you'll put in the date they graduated. If the scholar exited without graduating, you'll put that date in. You'll say whether or not they completed one academic year, and then you can check off as many reasons as are applicable for why they're no longer enrolled in the program. Item 2 in this section is how many years of academic funding the scholar received, and then that gets automatically calculated out by the system to the number of months that they owe in service obligation. And then also for item 4, the date by which service obligation must be completed, that also is a display. I don't have an exit date in here, but it's based on the date of exit or graduation plus the grace period, and then how many years of service they owe. And then, let's see, then there's section H, and that's only completed for scholars who graduated. You'll check what degrees or certificates the scholar received through the training program. You'll answer number 2, yes or no if the scholar completed an internship as part of the training. And then question 3 is if the scholar took an exam or measure to demonstrate knowledge and skills prior to completing the training program. If yes, you'll select the type of exam or measure they took and whether or not they passed, and you can enter multiple exams or measures. And then finally, for scholars who graduated and also those who exit without completing the program, you'll upload the completed and signed exit certification. Just like the other uploads, you'll get a note just reminding you to make sure any sensitive information, like the Social Security number, is redacted. And then you'll go and search on your computer to where it's saved, upload it. And then at the very bottom is just some directions about saving and submitting records, and you'll check the box that you're certifying the information you provided is true and correct to the best of your knowledge. Here's where, and then at the very, very bottom, you'll see the Save and Submit or the Save for Later buttons. If you save the record for later, that keeps them in the pending status, and it's not considered a complete record yet. Once everything, all of the red asterisk fields are completed, then you would save and submit the record, and then it's complete as of that point in time. For scholars who are still enrolled in the program, you still need to save and submit the record, and you'll still be able to continue to go in and update and edit the record until they've, completed the program or exited. So that, I know, was probably a lot that we just covered. We had sent out in previous emails, and we also have available on the website documents like screenshots of the scholar record and screenshots also of the pages that the scholars will see and the employers. So you have that available to you to look at, kind of if you want to see it more in hard copy form. I was just going to show a couple other things, but before I leave this page for now, I just want to check and see if there's any questions that it doesn't look like anyone's put anything in the chat box. So if you do have any questions about anything we've covered so far, anything on the scholar record that you want to look at more carefully or ask a specific question about, please let us know. But of course, once you start going and entering data, anything that comes up, please contact help desk, and we will work with you on that. So for brand new scholar records, what I just showed you kind of is what it'll look like and what you'll be doing when you first start going into the system and you have your migrated records. To add a new scholar record in the system, you'll click here above where it says to view all scholar records. It says add new scholar record. And the first thing that you're going to do is enter in the scholar's Social Security number, and that is to check and see if this scholar already exists in the system, because we know that a lot of scholars did receive funding under more than one grant, and we want to make sure that those scholars are connected and linked as one scholar. All of their grants are listed under them in the system to make sure that the service obligation is being fulfilled properly, and also so when that scholar logs into the system, they're able to see all of their grants at once and see how much they have left on one grant versus the other, and be able to keep track of it all together. So that's why we're checking initially to see, does this scholar already exist. But then once you get to this point, it is exactly the same as what we already went through, all of the same sections. You're just starting from scratch with entering in all of this information as soon as the scholar has enrolled in your program. In terms of reviewing employment, what's going to happen is, and Aaron already went through this, but a scholar in the system will submit their employment information, and then you will receive an email saying, Jane Doe has submitted employment. Please log into the system and check and verify their employment information. And you'll also see at the top of the page a little reminder to you saying, Jane Doe has employment that needs verifying or review. And you can click, that's going to be a link that you can click on, that scholar's name. Also from this View All Scholar Records page is where you'll be able to get to their employment in that employment column. There'll be a link that says pending project director review, and you'll click on it, and then it'll just show you very kind of succinctly, here's the name of the employer, their job duties, the title that the scholar entered for them, and then yes or no, if you agree or disagree that this is eligible employment. And if you say no, you'll describe in a text field why it's not eligible, and that the scholar will be notified, and they'll go from there. Okay, so that pretty much covers what we wanted to show you today. As we get closer to November and the scholars will be coming in and entering employment, we'll maybe do a recorded training or a resource that gives you more of those details on what that employment review piece will look like. We didn't want to kind of overwhelm you today because there's a lot you have to do starting out, and we'll refresh your memory and give you some more guidance on that employment piece as it gets closer. Also, I just wanted to remind you all or mention that we will be doing sessions both for grantees and for scholars at the fall NCRE conference in Washington, where we'll talk more about the employment piece then, and also, do some more demo and cover just any of this that we know grantees are struggling with in particular, So we'll be talking more about all of this then as well. And it doesn't look like anyone has put any questions in. So I think I'm going to pass it back to Erin now.
Thanks, Amy. Just a couple last reminders here and next steps, things that we have discussed a little bit, but some things that we definitely want to make sure to reemphasize and highlight. So as you know, the service obligation requirements are the same as they were when you were working in PIMS. It is based on the program, not our system. So just a reminder, scholars who have received funding after September of 2016, and if they leave the program prior to 1 year, they will not have the opportunity to repay through service. Rather, they will automatically be referred for a cash repayment of their obligation. Another highlight certainly are for you as project directors and grantees. You must approve employment within the system in order for scholars to get credit, as we discussed earlier. The criteria for determining whether that employment is eligible or not has not changed and remains the same. In terms of documentation reminders, as we mentioned earlier, scholars themselves may be able to submit repayment deferral or waiver requests through the system. And for scholars who, in order for that to occur, scholars must have their agreements on file within their scholar record. You as grantees are responsible for uploading these agreements into the scholar record. And the exit certifications that you upload must exactly match the dates, amounts, grant numbers, individual names. All of the information contained within the exit certification must match what is described within excuse me, the scholar record. If it does not, and the scholar, if you're, say, reviewing a scholar record or your scholar identifies that something is different after they have exited, and you are not able to modify the information within their scholar record because they have already exited, please contact the help desk, and we're able to review and adjust the information as needed. But when you are uploading the exit certification, please very closely review whether the amounts or the total information contained within the exit certification directly matches that within the scholar record. If there are discrepancies between these agreements and it could potentially impact the scholar's ability to either repay or fulfill their service obligation, or it may have impacts on you as the grantee yourself, as it is the responsibility of you and your university to ensure that this documentation and the scholar agreements, particularly the exit certification, are valid and accurate. Can you go to the next one? And again, just a review of the timeline. Between now and August 30th, please log into the PIMS system. If you haven't by August 30th, our staff will be contacting you to remind you to do so. And then between now and October 31st, the most important date, is really looking at each of the scholar records contained within PIMS for your grant, completing those scholar records, ensuring that all the documentation is uploaded, and that the demographic, contact, and training information for each scholar record is accurate, and submit those records. Again, for those, that applies to all scholars who have not yet completed his or her payback obligation. So it includes those who are actively enrolled as well as those who are fulfilling their obligation. For moving forward, starting in November, scholars will have access to the system to be able to actively enter in employment and review and confirm the information within their scholar record. And then you as grantees moving forward will be responsible for approving any employment information that are submitted by the scholars. So again, in terms of immediate next steps, an email will be delivered to you from rltthelpdesk@ed.gov. You'll receive this email on Tuesday, the 13th. You'll receive this email with login instructions on how to log into the PIMS system, and again, do so by the 30th. You will also, as part of your login and signing up for the site, you'll be required to download the Google Authenticator app and set up your multi-factor authentication. Again, the resources and instructions to do so are available on the pdp.ed.gov/RSA home training website. This process is very simple and relatively straightforward. If you encounter any issues, please, whether it's establishing the multi-factor authentication or logging into the system in general, please feel free to contact the help desk. And again, by October 31st, complete and submit any of the pending scholar records in the system, those that are scholars who are either actively enrolled or have still not yet fulfilled their obligation. And then certainly create and submit any scholar records of newly enrolled scholars that need to be included. We also ask that you alert scholars that in November they'll be required to log into the system and that they'll be receiving an email from the PIMS system similarly to the notification that you'll receive on Tuesday. We strongly encourage you to encourage your scholars to visit the website prior to November. As we get closer, as Amy said, we'll be including resources specifically for scholars to help explain the requirements and responsibilities they will have within the system, and also provide additional in addition to those resources, webinars or recorded training sessions for them to be able to understand how to operate within the system. As we mentioned, your ongoing responsibilities, updating the scholar record throughout the year within 30 days of any change to the scholar's status or new enrolled scholars within 30 days. You're expected to update and enter their scholar record. And then also, so that is throughout the year. Also during the traditional annual fall data collection, you will be asked to update and confirm the status of your scholar records as well on an annual basis. So obviously between now and October 31st, you will already be doing that, but this time next year, we'll be contacting you to ask that you go in and update and ensure that the information within the system is up to date. And then on an ongoing basis, throughout the year, reviewing the submitted employment for scholars and determining if it's eligible. So in terms of resources available, as we mentioned, there are a number of resources on the PIMS website itself. Available at the link above here. We'll distribute this information following the webinar and certainly within the welcome email that you'll receive next week. In addition to overall training and resources available, we have an extensive list of frequently asked questions, both regulatory and frequently asked questions related to the system itself. We strongly encourage you to review those and use them as a reference. Our help desk staff, which I'll talk about in just a moment, are always here to help, but many of the times we receive questions, we will be directly quoting from the FAQs because they are so extensive and comprehensive. So if you encounter an issue, I would encourage you first to turn to the frequently asked questions. And if for some reason you're not able to find the adequate answer there, then we definitely encourage you to contact the help desk. As Amy said previously, it's available 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., Monday through Friday, Eastern Time. Typically, we will respond to inquiries within a 24-hour period. Certainly, over the next few months, as all of the RLTT grantees are setting themselves up in the system, that may be a little more delayed, but we pride ourselves on our responsiveness within the help desk. So please utilize that as a resource. And again, it's available by email or by phone if needed, which we'll list later on. So we do have a little extra time, so folks on the line, if you want to include it in the chat box, if there are, or certainly submit any questions or responses, rather, that you may have to the help desk or to us directly. Please think through what are additional training materials that would be helpful for you or certainly your scholars. What additional trainings would you like us to be able to provide? And then if there are any specific concerns that you have in terms of entering the data or navigating or operating within the system, we want to hear that from you as well. So certainly if you have direct responses to these questions now, we'll encourage you to include them in the chat box. But if they occur to you after the session is over, we definitely always want to hear from grantees, scholars, and employers, any users of the site, what tools or resources would be more helpful and what are things that you're concerned with or are challenging for you. So.
And if you want, there's a little raise your hand button that is sort of towards the bottom of the list of participants. If you do want to ask your question, go ahead and raise your hand and we can unmute you if you prefer to talk rather than put a question in the chat box. I hope everyone completely knows what they're doing and it's all very clear, and that's why we're not getting questions.
And as we said, the help desk is available 12 hours a day, 5 days a week. We strongly encourage you to use that as a resource if and when you do have questions that come up. In addition, utilizing the resources and FAQ documents on the website are there to help you and also there to help your scholars. So feel free to review those, consult those, and also distribute them to your staff who may become secondary users on the site, as well as those who are actually enrolled in your program and your scholars themselves. Please distribute them far and wide. They are there to help you and your colleagues. Well, we don't have any additional questions at this time, so we will, again, distribute this recording or post this recording with closed captioning to the Training and Resources webpage for you and your colleagues to be able to access. Again, on Tuesday the 13th, you'll be receiving an email from RLTT helpdesk@ed.gov. Providing you with the login information and access to the site and to log into the site using the steps that Amy outlined earlier. In addition to the email, you'll also have the opportunity to connect with our help desk via email or phone if you encounter any issues if they are not outlined within if it's unclear when you're trying to log into the system.
So it looks like we have a question. Will the grant scholars be having a webinar for PIMS? Do you know when that will be? I believe most likely what we will do is do like a recorded webinar, so something very similar to this that we will then post on the website and email the scholars the link to prior to them being able to access the system. With, thousands of scholars, it's a little more difficult to do this type of webinar, but we will definitely be doing something like this and putting it on the website for them to access, and also pointing out, like Erin said, the number of other resources that we have specifically for the the scholars, I'm sorry, on the website. You're welcome. Okay, well, thank you all so much for sticking with us today. It was a long one. We appreciate it. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Please reach out with any questions that come up.
Thank you all.